I'm joined in the studio today by a professor of history in the Department of History here at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His new book, Brazil, was published by Polity Books, and it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Enjoy the show. Professor Joel, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
I was looking forward to having you here to talk about Brazil. We have been running a series on international affairs. Last week we had Professor Jayati and we were looking at India. So to get us started with our discussion, I would like you to describe what you consider to be core ideas of the book and its central argument.
Thanks. So it's in a series by Polity Press in Cambridge, England, that asks specifically historians to write books for policymakers, business people, literate people, people who just want to know about a country's present by having a really good sense of its past. So they don't want heavily footnoted historical studies, they want a broad sweep of the country. And so they asked me to do a book about Brazil, and that's why it's just called Brazil. There's a book France, there's a book China, there's a book on Russia. And it's a book about Brazil, and they said, well, so what would people who are watching Brazil today, what would help them understand and put in context, in historical context, Brazil today? So it's the study of the nation from 1808, and that's a very important date, to the present. And what it deals with a series of questions, but the three biggest questions I deal with are the nation's long struggle to establish a democracy, and it is a democracy today, and it's a very vibrant democracy. Its long legacy of dealing with issues of race. Brazil, of course, had an indigenous population that was heavily decimated by the Portuguese, but there's still indigenous people in Brazil and there's indigenous influence. But in the 19th century, Brazil was the world's largest slaveholding society. Abolition came very late. Abolition in Brazil is in 1888. So how does Brazil deal with race? A country that people think is roughly 50% African heritage, maybe more. And then there's a very unique question about Brazil that's unlike a lot of other nations. And you mentioned India. Brazil is so big physically that all of the nations of Europe comfortably fit in its borders, including Eastern Europe, including Ukraine and Belarus. They all fit in Brazil. Unlike India, which was a British colony where the British came and built infrastructure to connect the nation, Brazil didn't have that. When railroads came with British and American capital, they were small lines that went from productive areas, sugar areas, coffee areas, to the port. There was never an attempt to draw the nation together, and kind of the proof of that, beyond its just size, is that in 1960, they literally moved the national capital from Rio de Janeiro to a new city in the interior of Brasilia. And because it's a totally new city designed from the ground up, the city outline is not a square or a circle, it's the shape of an airplane. And it's symbolically shaped like an airplane because there's a belief that Brazil, to be a modern nation, needs to connect itself with modern transportation. So they go on a major road building campaign. The automobile industry becomes important. My second book is about the role of the automobile, both physically and kind of mentally, culturally, in unifying Brazil. And in fact, Lula, the current president of Brazil, is a former automobile worker, and that's significant. And so the size of the nation and the struggle to gain control over the national territory to create a politics that works for economic reasons, that's a key part of the story. So there's a social component around race, There's an economic, geographical component around geography, and that's very related to race, by the way. And then there is a political component, the struggle to create a democracy, and that's, of course, related to both race and geography and also the economy. And just kind of to further talk about the significance of that, Brazil is not just physically big. Brazil is the most populated nation in South America. The majority of people in South America are Brazilians. Now, Mexico is a massive country with almost 100 million people, so Brazil is bigger than Mexico, but it doesn't make up the majority of all of Latin America. But it does make up literally the majority of South America. So that's kind of the structure of like, why is this important? I wrote the book during the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro, and I completed the book as Lula, who had been a two-term president, came back and took the presidency again. So the political piece is front and center.
So what is it that make Brazil a unique case study of issues around racial discrimination, inequality, dictatorship, and regional rivalries that you actually raise as thematic concerns in the book?
Yeah, well, the regional rivalries are very much related to two things I just talked about, the enormous size and the failure to integrate the nation. So when they open Brasilia, one of the things they do is they create every state capital is going to be connected to Brazil by a highway, and that's great, but that's in the 1960s. So what happened when you talk about regional rivalries is that each region, had commodities and so forth that it produced well, and often had better lines of communication to its markets. So people in Sao Paulo often knew more about what was going on in New York and in Frankfurt, Germany, the United States and Germany being the two biggest consumers of coffee, than they knew what was going on in the northeast of Brazil. So a lot of that has to do with that. But Brazil also has two really important myths, national myths. And I think national myths are super important. In the United States, we have a myth about being a benevolent democracy, and da-da-da. In Brazil, the two myths are, and they're based in some truth, but they're myths, are one, that the nation is not marked by as much conflict as most nations in the global south, particularly not as much as other Latin American nations. And the other myth is of so-called racial democracy. And I'll get that one's really important and complicated. But the myth of conciliation is based on Brazil's very unique history. So in 1807, 1808, Napoleon is going west into France and Portugal, and as he's heading to Portugal, the Portuguese royal family and the court get on a series of Portuguese and British warships, and they sail to Brazil. And for about a decade, the Portuguese Empire is ruled from a colony, that the Portuguese crown is in Rio. And the king goes back and he leaves his son, but eventually the kind of process of Latin American independence is taking place in the 1810s and 1820s. And in 1822, the son of the Portuguese monarch simply declares Brazilian independence. He says, "Fico," which means I stay. I mean, it's called the Grito de Ipiranga, the cry of Ipiranga, because he was in a town called Ipiranga. And there's certainly some conflict around that, but not a massive war of independence. You had a very destructive, long war of independence in Mexico. You had a very destructive South American war of independence with people like San Martin from Argentina meeting up with Simon Bolivar. Bolivar comes down from present-day Colombia, Martin up from Argentina, and they meet up in Peru. Doesn't happen in Brazil. There's tremendous violence in Brazil. You can't have a massive slaveholding society without violence, but you don't have wars that are similar to those in the rest of Latin America. So there's a mythology that Brazil is different. In terms of racial democracy, that idea was really created by a fascinating and really important intellectual named Gilberto Freire, whose work was very influential, as I was saying earlier to you privately, to the Portuguese and how they colonized Africa and kept their colonies in the 20th century. And Freire was white, I mean, by Brazilian standards white, from the Northeast, and he was educated in the United States. He was educated at Baylor, in Waco, Texas, in 1912, I think he graduated. Then he went to Columbia in Harlem, essentially, and got his PhD at Columbia. And then he taught at Stanford before returning to Brazil. And so Freire had a very clear sense of the kind of the almost apartheid of the United States in that era. And he saw Brazil as very different, and he saw race as benign in Brazil. Now, he's wrong. There's tremendous discrimination on the basis of race, but it's different and it's unique. And so Brazilians have kind of patted themselves on the back about not having the overt racial conflict of the United States, and also because Brazil had a very long military dictatorship from 1964 to 85, there was no room for a civil rights movement because there were no civil rights at all, during very limited civil rights. So there's a myth that Brazil's not a conflict-laden place. There's plenty of conflict. There's a myth that it's not a racist place. There's plenty of racism. But it's very different from the US context or the Western European context. I'll give you another just example of something that an outsider would be stunned by about Brazil. The majority of people of Japanese descent in the world who do not live in Japan live in Brazil. It's not more Japanese origin people live in Brazil than anywhere else. It's the majority. All of the people of Japanese descent in the world added up, more than half of them live in Brazil. And that's a fun fact, and it's about kind of farming and immigration, but it's also about the way that Brazilians imagine themselves as a multi-ethnic society. And there's a large Christian Arab population, there's a significant Jewish population, there's a very large Italian and German immigrant populations, all came in the late 19th, early 20th century. But Brazilians congratulate themselves on being kind of a melting pot and diverse, and they are, but there are still very clear racial and ethnic lines. So people of Italian or German origin are Brazilians, but people of Japanese origins are Japanese Brazilians. There's a growing Korean population, Korean Brazilians. Arab, and they call them Syro-Lebanese, which is kind of a made-up thing, but when they came, it was still the Ottoman Empire. And certainly Jews. Jews came before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust, and they're Jewish Brazilians. So Brazil, and again, people of color are Afro-Brazilians. So there's a question of the hyphen, that on the one hand, there's a celebration of Brazilianness, but on the other hand, there's a question of what is a Brazilian and who is a true Brazilian. And that's reflected in economic data, and it's reflected in politics. There's never been a black president of Brazil. There's been a woman president, but there's never been a black president, right? There's never been there are the woman president and a man who was president in the 1950s, and one more president, are children of immigrants, but all European immigrants, Eastern European immigrants and Central European immigrants. But the idea that someone who was Asian Brazilian or Jewish Brazilian or Arab Brazilian or Afro-Brazilian, those people don't ascend to the highest levels of politics. So those are, that speaks to kind of the complexity of current race relations, current politics that are based in the history and the structure of the society.
So I understand that when you were working on page proofs for the book, you were asked by the director of Polity Books to include a discussion of the January 2023 riots in Brasilia. What was your overall assessment of the recent election?
So it's interesting. I can talk a little bit more about the book before I get to that. So I was asked to write this book, and it was during the pandemic, and I was really taking my time, and the editors called me and said, look, you have two choices. You can either do this, finish it up before the election so we can get it out and people can reference it during the election, or you can wait until after the election and it'll be very up to date. And so being behind, I took the latter one, I mean, I did, but there was a logic to that. So I promised them the final manuscript within a week of the election. There was a runoff, and I actually sent it, emailed it to Britain 2 or 3 days after Bolsonaro conceded. And as I was working the page proofs, there was a riot on January 8th. So the election's in 2022, and January, Lula's already president. The inaugural's on the 1st. And pro-Bolsonaro people riot in Brasilia, and Lula handled it brilliantly and completely kneecapped the movement, and we can talk about why that happened there as opposed to the United States. But But my sense of that election was that Bolsonaro was a terrible president, and yet it was much closer than anyone thought it was going to be. And I think it was close because, much as in the United States with someone like Donald Trump, and Bolsonaro associates himself with Trump, that people were unaware of the level of racism and the level of classism and deep sexism and homophobia. And Lula is a classic progressive, and he has a broad coalition. It's very close to feminist groups and excuse me, what's called in Brazil Movimento Gay, the gay rights movement, and there was just a kind of a harnessing of hatred against a broad coalition of progressive groups. And so Lula should have, Lula, who's very popular, would have easily won a third term, would have beaten Bolsonaro when Bolsonaro ran. I mean, one of the stories about this election is that when Bolsonaro is running for president, Lula is arrested and tried and convicted on corruption charges and thrown in jail so that he can't run. And so what it is, the right wing has kind of seized parts of the judiciary and is keeping Lula from running. Several things about that conviction. The first is he was arrested for receiving a condominium in a beach community called Guarujá in exchange for supporting certain things. He denied this. There's no evidence of this happening. A group of his supporters went to the condominium and started living there, and they were arrested. And they said, but Lula said we can live here. And the police said, but Lula doesn't own it. And they said, exactly, right? But that wasn't enough to get his conviction vacated. The prosecutor was surreptitiously recorded. It's unclear who made the recording, but it made its way to the media, telling an aide, we had to fake charges against Lula to keep him from being reelected. In Brazil, you can be president as many times as you're elected, but only 2 times in a row. So he had 2 terms, and he left, and his protege was elected, and then she was reelected, and then she was impeached also on trumped-up fake charges. And so Lula was, constitutionally able to run for president, and members of the judiciary just fabricated charges against him. And the UN openly referred to Lula as a political prisoner. And so the momentum just moved to finally release him, and he was released, and he immediately became the front runner for the 2022 election. But again, it was a much closer election than people thought it would be. The idea was, people thought he'd win by 10%, that he might win in the first round. Lots of people run, you need a majority in the first round to avoid a runoff. Didn't get it, and actually lost some percentage points in the runoff. So he won, but he won very narrowly, and that shocked a lot of people, myself included. I had no idea. But Bolsonaro had done a very good job. The other thing that was new that a lot of people missed was that an important voting bloc in Brazil is evangelical Christians. Brazil is the largest nominally Catholic country in the world, but a lot of people aren't particularly religious. And evangelical Christians have been making gains in Brazil since the 1970s. Bolsonaro's wife, who's I think her 3rd or 4th wife, is a very prominent evangelical, and he always hinted that he'd converted to Protestantism, but he got the evangelical vote, which is very, very right-wing, very similar to the United States. So there were just a lot of political surprises to people. I don't follow, I'm a historian, I don't follow the politics that closely, but even people who followed it closely were stunned by the power of the evangelical vote, both when Bolsonaro was elected and in his attempt at re-election, which Lula won, but people were surprised by how close that vote was.
Viewers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. If you want a copy of this book, click the link that is in the description panel on the upload for this video.